Hello, shalom, and welcome to another episode of Community Relations Corner, where we discuss issues of concern to New York's Jewish community and our friends and partners all over the metropolitan New York area. I'm your host, Michael Miller, the Executive Vice President and CEO of the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York, JCRC-NY. On each episode of Community Relations Corner, we're joined by guests representing the political, religious, economic, and diverse community leadership, generally speaking, in New York. We're making that shift today in another direction to the Midwest, many of whom I've had the honor of getting to know or have been colleagues over the course of my tenure at JCRC-NY. Together, we're going to discuss current events. Today's show is very current, impacting New York's Jewish community and its neighbors, as well as the state of the city. And today we're talking about the state of the nation, the state of the world. Today we are joined by partners from the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, in the state of Minnesota, to hear about what it's been like this week with Tuesday's conviction of Derek Chauvin in the George Floyd murder case and the murder trial. And we are joined by two very, very special individuals. First, it's my pleasure to introduce Steven Belton. Steven is the president and CEO of the Urban League of the Twin Cities. And Steve Hunegs, who is the executive director, my colleague, of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas. Welcome, Steven and Steve. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Michael. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you for taking time out of your day, an hour or two earlier than it is over here on the East Coast. Let's just turn back the clock and talk about the atmosphere within the Twin Cities this past year in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. How would you characterize it, and particularly within the framework of your respective roles at the Urban League and at the JCRC? Steven?
So the atmosphere, of course, would depend on what day you're talking about, and it would talk about what else is going on, the context. But it also is defined, or at least experienced, by your distance from the epicenter of the events. And so by distance, I mean, so one could certainly do that geographically, how far you are from 38th and 4th, or 38th and Chicago Avenue, Minneapolis, which is where George Floyd was killed, or you could measure it by the distance physically between the Black community, or where the Black communities in the Twin Cities lie. But it also, the atmosphere also would vary depending on, your distance in relation to how close you are to these issues, how important they are. So I can speak from my perspective, and certainly from the perspective of Urban League Twin Cities, that it has been nonstop activation, nonstop irritation, nonstop concern and tension, nonstop anxiety, and nonstop trauma in the approximately 11 months since George Floyd was killed. This has been at least part of every conversation, extended conversation that I've had and that other people experience. It's what's on the minds of Uber drivers and people in boardrooms and in barbershops and in nail salons. It's what people are talking about, what people were interested in. And in some ways, it became a touchstone. People began to talk about where they were, similar to the way we talk about where were you when JFK was killed, right, and where were you when the moon, people landed on the moon. And so it's where were you when George Floyd was killed, and what was going on with you? People measure their distance by their sense of relatives. This could have been my cousin, this could have been my brother, or they measured by distance of their own experience. I have experienced, they would say, this kind of deal. So it has taken over the conversation in some ways. It's taken all the air out of the room. It's defined who we are. And of course, we experiences, we'll probably talk about later, being the epicenter in the country, if not the world, for social justice and for police reform. This was unexpected. Nobody asked for this or anticipated this, but it was thrust upon us, and it's something that we've lived for several months.
As I turn to Steve, I also want to mention, of course, that this program is being co-sponsored by an organization that both the Jewish Relations Council of Minnesota and Dakotas and JCRC New York are members of, and that's the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. And we thank them, Melanie Gorelik and the whole team there, for their support and co-sponsorship. So Steve, can you respond to that same question from the Jewish perspective in terms of the atmosphere? And maybe actually, Stephen and Steve, where were you on the day that George Floyd was killed? And how did that change or reorient your role within the framework of being the executive of the JCRC?
Thank you, Michael. And I note, of course, solemnly that as we speak, the funeral services for Daunte Wright are now occurring. So let's keep Daunte's family and friends and the entire community in our hearts as that moment is upon us right now. Thank you, Michael, for this invitation. And if I could just take a moment of personal privilege here, just to say thank you to Noam, thank you to Rebecca, thank you to you for your years of leadership. I'm slightly off track here, but I read this quote from Dr. Eliezer Schnall, who of course you'll recognize from Yeshiva University, but perhaps just to give everybody a little bit greater sense of you, Michael. Quote, at a time when the U.S. has seen increased levels of social tension and friction, it is especially important for our students to learn from one of the Jewish world's best known and most successful community bridge builders. Of course, that's you. So I just want to express thank you as you begin the transition in your various roles in the CRC world. And thank you for all that you've given us over the years. Okay.
Thank you.
Now I promise I'll answer the question. Okay. There you have it. One way to look at the impact atmosphere, the word of the question is, well, let's look at the newspapers. Here's the Star Tribune from Wednesday, Minneapolis. Pioneer Press, St. Paul from Wednesday. Of course, the New York Times. So, it's as Stephen suggests, it's global, right? But of course, it has been all encompassing. And you talked about the atmosphere. The word I would use up until the conviction was the shadows. We're all living in the shadows of the murder of George Floyd. Given the conviction and the piece of hopefulness that represents, I'll change the word to the penumbra, a slightly more optimistic word. Now we're living in the penumbra of it. And also for us Twin Cityans, the Penumbra Theater, one of the great pioneer theaters in African-American art and showcasing the work of African-American playwrights too. So it has a real meaning to us. Arc of accountability, to use sort of alliteration here, is important. And I'll take you back a few months, and that is the conviction of Michael Hari, who was the bomber of the Dar el-Farouk Islamic Center in Richfield, a suburb of Minneapolis. And that represented an important time to this federal prosecution of this terrorist, this religious terrorist, and his conviction, and we await his sentencing. Now we go to, thankfully, the conviction of Chauvin in the case. And as Attorney General Ellison said the other day, we're not here celebrating justice. That's a long, long road ahead of us. But increased accountability. And now that the jury has returned the verdict of guilty in Chauvin case, the Dar el-Farouk case, maybe we can see something of a better future with a long ways to go for reasons that we'll discuss in this conversation. I'll also point out that the legislature passed last year the Minnesota Police Accountability Act, ban on warrior training, ban on chokeholds, requirements for duty to intercede, etc. My point here is that, sort of in Dr. King's word, it's incremental, but hopefully we're moving in a direction towards justice. And as I look at the atmosphere of Minnesota, with all that we faced and the entire country and the globe, I see reasons I see for hope, but the distance before us remains long. And turning to my friend and mentor and great community leader, Steven Belton, I know that he and I are in partnership with this as best we can over the years. And I'm certainly proud that he's joining us on this program. And it's marvelous to be here with everybody today.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you both. And particularly thank you to Stephen. Well, again, we're going back in history, even though you showed us the headlines from this week. Let's paint the picture of what Minneapolis St. Paul was, or the Minneapolis that led to this murder. the disparities that there are, the racial disparities within housing, education, employment, healthcare, and income. Some might argue that these disparities cross racial boundaries, but how does systemic racial injustice, as it has been termed, exacerbate the opportunities or lack thereof available to the Black community and potentially lead to what took place just over a year ago? Stephen?
Well, Minnesota has the distinction, the dishonor of having some of the worst Black-white disparities in the country. And I don't mean, like bottom 10. I mean like bottom 2 or 3 in some key categories, important categories that I think in many ways inform what happened with, or at least are related to what happened with George Floyd. So we have the worst home ownership disparity, Black-white home ownership disparity in the country. These are general numbers, not specific, but a little over 70% of whites in Minnesota own their own home. It's under 30% for African Americans in a home. We have the worst home ownership disparity. We also have among the worst disparities in income, with African Americans earning less than half of whites, of the average for whites in the state. We have the worst, or among the worst, educational disparities in the country, and some of the very worst health disparities. And so when you combine all of these, and that's we discover new disparities every day. This is the land of 10,000 lakes, and I remember learning last year that we have one of the worst swimming disparities in the country. You would think that this disparity was an analysis of the number or the percentage of white children who know how to swim versus Black children. And so I'm simply show that as an example. There are disparities across the board, and all of these, in our view, result from white supremacy and an agenda that has framed public policy based on white supremacy. An example of that is in the housing and home ownership area, where you've had years and years and years of disparities, of redlining, of real estate practices that steered African Americans, and I might mention Jews as well, to certain neighborhoods. Indeed, the largest concentration of African Americans is in North Minneapolis, which is a neighborhood that at one time was occupied, particularly around the turn of the 20th century, was occupied and populated largely by Jews and Blacks, because those were the only neighborhoods in the city that they were allowed to own or to purchase property in. So years of discrimination, of redlining, of restrictive housing covenants. There's great analysis and research now coming out of University of Minnesota and out of other places that document the history of racial covenants in this community. I happen to live on a street called Edmond Boulevard, which is named after the realtor or the housing developer in the 1920s in Minneapolis, who actually started the first racial covenant in Minnesota. And those covenants typically restricted Blacks, Jews, Mongolians was another term that they used, from owning property in these particular areas. So the vestige of all of that supremacist agenda has been to create a population and to create policies that restricted access to African Americans as part of the population, that limited opportunities, that provided harsher incarceration in terms, and that created a system of policing that was designed to protect the rights of white people. It was the protect and serve really meant to protect the interest of white people and to serve their interest as well. I think all of that manifests in the actions that you had in Derek Chauvin, who, as you will recall, anyone who has seen the video, he knew that he was being videotaped, but he acted with impunity, even though he was executing and torturing George Floyd. He stared at the camera very nonchalantly because he did not expect to be held accountable. That, in our view, is sort of the culmination of this agenda.
But before I turn to Steve, is the George Floyd case just one case of many cases, but in this instance, it was videotaped, and therefore we know about it? Were there other George Floyd instances of such brutality on the part of law enforcement?
Yeah, one of our sister organizations, the NAACP here locally, has estimated, I don't know what their estimate is based on, that there have been over 100 cases similar to this in the Twin Cities. I haven't seen other data on this, but I know anecdotally, just from the 30 or 35 years that I've been involved in this work, that there have been numerous cases of African Americans who have been killed, shot, harmed, by law enforcement in the state of Minnesota, but specifically in the metropolitan area where over 90% of the Black population resides in the state of Minnesota, and they have not been held accountable. The the Derek Chauvin verdict was actually the first time that a police officer in the entire history of the state of Minnesota, a state that was incorporated, there was statehood was somewhat 1857 or something like that, Steve. Do you know?
1858. You're right there. You're right there.
I was close, within a year. All right, and missed it by that much. A state that since 1858, first time in its history that a white police officer has been held accountable, has been judged guilty, and one of the very few times that one has actually been charged in the state of Minnesota. So yeah, this in some ways, and I'll stop here, Michael, this doesn't necessarily feel so much like justice as it feels like it's justice if you get caught on camera. And so if you're looking for precedent, I'm not sure how broad the precedent is, except in the narrow circumstances where you're actually videotaped using excessive force.
And Steve, we in the Jewish community have always been known for being in the forefront of the civil rights movement, whether it's nationally or in the various states or in municipalities. So what role has the Jewish community been playing? I mean, Steven just articulated a whole series of incidents that have taken place, and the NAACP says there are over 100 similar circumstances. Where has the Jewish community been, and particularly, obviously, the JCRC, but the Jewish community as a whole in addressing these issues, confronting them?
Steve was honored to be Steve's guest on the ULTC Urban League Twin Cities program, Real Talk. We had a very good and honest and candid discussion about a number of these issues. And Michael, if I could just take a moment here, it's almost hard to answer that question without looking back and framing it and contextualizing it. And we were talking about this yesterday. Rightfully so, they have the 1619 Project, which describes and tries to anchor American history in the enslavement and transportation of Africans to this country for bondage, right? And how awful that is, and the consequences that has led to in our country. We came, the Jewish community, 1654, right? The first Jews came to that part of the New World. We tell a very different story in that sense about our connection to the United States, what it means to us, freedom and liberty, and the like. And I think part of this discussion between our communities is this all-important discussion of how we view the world. And I think it becomes more important all the time that we have this discussion. I think we the Jewish community, need to learn far more about the African American experience and what it means. And I hope the African American community is interested in learning more about the Jewish connection to the United States and what it means to our people. But the crossroads is something that's important to us at the JCRC and the ways in which we've worked with Steven, and that is the role of law enforcement. Generally, not exclusively, but generally, when we see police officers of the Minnesota National Guard, we take comfort in their presence, not universally. And we've come at the JCRC to learn far more about the relationship of Jews of color and law enforcement and the like, as we've become more attuned to those issues. There's something that's important to us because one of our responsibilities, as you know, Michael, is role in community security and our very good, healthy working relationships with all levels of law enforcement, is to try to assist without being patronizing or condescending in a way which tries to build bridges. Indeed, next to last paragraph of our statement was And we want to continue in that role. We want to expand upon that role in trying to make this a better relationship. I mean, Steven could tell me if I'm being naive or not about it, but that's something that's important to us. And a point of pride for us has been working with the African American congregations on physical security for houses of worship. And that's somewhere we can exchange expertise, exchange ideas. I mean, you think about it, Michael, one thing, unfortunately, that we have in common are two of the great, awful, psychically scarring attacks on houses of worship. Mother Emanuel in 2015, of course, in Charleston, and Eitz Chaim in Pittsburgh, separated by 4 years. So I think in this realm, and we could talk about all sorts of different things, it's an area of commonality, and I don't mean to be an area of commonality, an area of when it's something that is
It's
not painful, very, very painful. Thank you. That's the word we're looking for. Nevertheless, it's a place from which we can build, right? So I think we need to find the areas from which we can build. That's something that we were committed to in our CRC and have been doing for some time, but simultaneous with, let's have healthy, good, honest discussions about our friendship, places where we agree and places where we disagree. Too.
Right. So how does this conviction relate directly to that point, Steve, and to Steven? What difference does this conviction make to the roles that you both play? Steven in the Urban League, Steve at the JCRC. Is there, you spoke about it, you both alluded to it, about this isn't a celebration, but there's hope. Like next steps, what is a conviction in this case, as precedented as it is, mean to the actual work that you are both doing organizationally?
Who would you like to have answer the question?
Steve.
Oh, it opens the eyes, I would think, to the Jewish community. Our eyes have been opened, of course, for 9 minutes and 29 seconds of pure raw brutality and the exercise of power, which ended in the death of an African-American man in the streets of Minneapolis. We all know that. But I think now it's starkly before us that a jury has convicted the officer of murder. I mean, murder in plain sight, right? And if that doesn't shake everyone to their very core, I mean, the events that put the justice system working, it ought to. Jerry Blackwell, one of the special prosecutors in the case, and someone I'm proud to call a friend, he uses beautiful analogy of a bouquet, this bouquet of people that came together that were witnesses to this heinous act. And I think we should draw strength from that too. All of that said, it is a time of reckoning, and I would hope our community, starting with everybody participating, and I know they are in this call, would mean it's time to really come to grips with the issues of this country, right? And I think I'm guilty of it more so than anybody on this call, to try to, at times rationalize, prevaricate. We've had the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, bless his soul, Walter Mondale, who just passed away, so right. Significantly responsible for that piece of legislation. And there has been advancement, but that is not a defense, by the way. That's not a defense. And I think we have to come to grips with that part of the African-American experience to realize, while our gains have been made, this is in a sense a sui generis, unique in of itself, but it's of course not unique, which is the most horrible thing when you think of the statistics that Steven cited from the NAACP. And so sort of the bottom line is, I keep repeating myself, is just coming to grips with our community. And once you start at that point, what it is that we need to do in tandem with the rest of the community.
Yeah, but so Steven, were you surprised by the outcome of this trial? And regardless of whether you were or whether you weren't, what is the sentiment currently in the Black community in the Minneapolis, St. Paul area, within the Twin Cities? Again, let's go back to that issue of non-celebration, but hope and most particularly next steps. But the first question is, was it surprising to you that was the outcome of this trial?
Well, anybody who was paying attention saw that the evidence was overwhelming. against Derek Chauvin. And so as a lawyer, as a recovering lawyer, I should say, I wasn't surprised, that the jury, made its decision and made it quickly to convict. I will say that I dared not hope for it, because our history, the history of Black people in this state is such that we don't get prosecutions or convictions of police officers or any law enforcement that has brutalized or has harmed Black bodies. And so I dared not hope, for pure fear of disappointment, but also just because informed by the past. But the evidence looked pretty overwhelming to me, and it's clear that it was overwhelming and clear to the jury as well. Having said that, Michael, the question of what's changed or what does it mean, two things kind of frame my opinion. So one, Steve alluded to earlier, noting that as we speak, the funeral service for the homegoing service for young Mr. Wright began at the same time this call did. I was supposed to be at that service, but I had made a commitment to this, and I wanted to be here because here's the sad truth, Michael and Steve and your audience. I've been to lots of funerals for African Americans who have lost their lives to law enforcement or to some other form of violence. Been to lots of them. I haven't had many invitations to participate in a JCRC panel, particularly to be interviewed by Michael Miller. And so it's important. One of the lessons going forward is that the work continues. And I think that certainly the funeral of an African-American man, again, gunned down by the police under very questionable circumstances, frames that going forward moment. The second piece is that I have two adult male sons, Michael, who ironically both live in New York City, and so they are. But I didn't call them up after the verdict and say it's okay to go outside now. You're safe. You don't have to worry about the police. And I didn't have to say to them, and I didn't call them. I wasn't able to call to them and say, remember the talk we had when you were 10 and 11 years old, and again when you were 12 and 13, and again when you were 15 and 16. Remember the talk? Well, forget that. It's no longer important. It's no longer relevant. You're safe. I wasn't able to do that. Right. What the frame for me in that context is that why is it that Black people are the only ones who have to have the talk with their kids? The talk being, of course, to warn them about the potential for them being harmed by law enforcement, to explain to them what all of the history of that is, and to tell them as best we can how to behave in the presence of police officers. Why do we have to do that? Why is that a responsibility of Black people? And why do we continue to have to do that? Nothing about the Derek Chauvin conviction changed any of that. And so we are on a trajectory. I like to say, and I believe, again, as a recovering lawyer, that justice is not an outcome. It is a process, and we are still in process. And so that process going forward means that we've got a lot of work to do around policy reform. Indeed, we need to move from protest to policy, from protest to performance, and to some sort of change immediately. We have an opportunity in the Minnesota legislature, as we do nationally with the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. We have an opportunity in Minnesota to change laws that will make police more accountable, that will make it less likely that individuals, that Black people, brown people, and everybody will be stopped for spurious and sort of unimportant or relatively unimportant kinds of infractions, like having something dangling, air fresheners dangling from your rearview mirror, or for expired tabs. Those sorts of things are possibilities now, and I think we do have some momentum by doing this. Steve mentioned that we have, increased awareness, and that the Jewish community needs to become more aware. I appreciate awareness. It's one of the reasons I'm doing this, having this conversation right now. But what we're really looking for is actually a different. Steve mentioned Jerry Blackwell, who's also a friend of mine, and one of his many wonderful turns of phrase in there, as he told the jury that the defense was trying to argue that George Floyd didn't, that his heart was too big, but the real issue was that Derek Chauvin's heart was too small. What we're trying to do in this moment, the opportunity here is to change hearts. It's not merely enough to create awareness around these issues. We have to change hearts, and the changing of hearts means an extension of your humanity to us. And by you, I'm not singling out the Jewish community. I mean the broader community, and specifically, I mean law enforcement. They have to begin to see us as human beings. They need to see us in the same way they see their own children and their own family members. And that isn't, we're not there yet. I think if there is an inflection, it's an opening to be able to speak to people's minds and their hearts.
Yeah, so Steve, is the Jewish community open to heart surgery? Is there a willing?
It's heart massaging. I'm more interested in the surgery than less interested in surgery, just less invasive.
I'm not a physician, but it is a broader opening of valves and allowing messages to flow through and to be absorbed within one system. And I mean, there is an expression which is used all too frequently called woke. Is there a sense of wokedness within the Twin Cities, and most especially within the Jewish community, and an identification with what the African American community is seeking? Is that openness there, Steve?
Let's start with the premise that if we could take our favorite cardiologist, Steven Belton, to everybody's household, then we would achieve the level of heart-to-heart communication that we need. And maybe there is a way we can do that too, because Steven is such a wonderful speaker and helps us confront difficult truths in a way that wants us to improve. Steven, and not to brag on you, but the piece that Steven wrote in the Star Tribune, and this goes to let's take one step back, and I'm sure it's one of your favorites too, Michael. When we're faced with so much complexity in the world, we turn to our teachings, and I always think of Pirkei Avot, ethics of our. I'm sorry, I'm at home. Ethics of our elders, and say it's not our job to perfect the world, but we can't desist from the effort. Steven wrote a piece that was completely inspired by that when he said, okay, folks, you want to help the African American community? Join the board of an African American organization. Shop in an African American store. Live in an African American neighborhood. Expand your horizons so that you can understand how the African American community lives. If you want to engage with us, work with us, partner with us, etc. I think that's excellent advice in whatever realm you want to go forward in the sphere of improving and strengthening civil rights and community relations in Minnesota. I see our community, and I believe our history validates this, Michael, as an action-oriented community, particularly when given a goal. And I don't say this in a partisan light at all, but the old Supreme Court case, Equal versus Hopkins, talks about the right to vote being preservative of all others. And if we want to continue to strengthen or work on that arc of accountability, the voting rights and the preservation of voting rights are ever so critical. Without getting into the detail of it, and that's something I'm particularly passionate about. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act in particular has important pieces to protect the right to vote. And going back to that old teaching, Equal versus Hopkins, if you vote, you protect your rights, and that helps tremendously. And I'm not putting a partisan spin on this whatsoever. I think it's just fundamental American civics and constitutionalism that this is something we support and relates back to our community. So, let's get behind important pieces of legislation when they surface, whether at the state level or the federal level.
So that's really the next question I want to ask is how does this momentum get captured with practical, pragmatic activity, engagement, programs, projects, or is this the proverbial flash in the pan? It happened, it's over, life goes on. What activity can the Urban League and the JCRC, whether independently of each other or jointly, do to capture the spirit, Stephen?
So I think it's important to isolate or to identify that there are two unique factors about this moment, one of which can't or won't necessarily be repeated, and the other can and will. And so those two things are I don't think we're here but for Darnella Frazier's bystander video, 17-year-old who had the courage to keep her videotape, her video camera running. But for that, I don't think we have a conviction. I think you could line up the exact same witnesses, all of the people who were bystanders, all of the medical experts, have the police chief and all the cops who testified against Derek Chauvin. I think you do all of that, and I still think you get an acquittal across these charges. So the fact that we had that videotape is significant, because the next time may or may not be videotaped, and it probably won't be videotaped, at least having a bystander videotape. The other unique thing that happened was the demonstrations, and that's the thing that can and should and hopefully will continue. I do not conflate demonstration with the unlawful unrest, with the rioting that occurred. I mean the genuine demonstrations, the march. And one of the framing contexts that Steve and I both will recall in the past 11 months has been sort of nonstop demonstrations every day, it seemed. Certainly, maybe that's an exaggeration, but certainly in the first 3 months, it probably was every day. And since then, every week, there was some sort of demonstration, some sort of activity. That public pressure, I think, is what creates and frames this moment. Because but for that, I think you have elected officials and you have policymakers and you have people like Steve and me who are still sort of stuck in what their own agenda is, not thinking collaboratively, not thinking about who their allies are, and who sort of get stuck in a rut. Let me give you an example. The Republicans, so Minnesota has the only legislature in the country that split. That's one house is controlled. The House in Minnesota is controlled by Democrats, the Senate by Republicans. The leader of the Senate, I don't remember if it was the Senate or the House Republicans, the day after the verdict, so it would have been yesterday, was asked by his Democratic colleague whether or not this was going to give some impetus for Republican support for the reform measures that are underway. And he took that moment to say, his understanding of the verdict was that it's proof that our system works. And so because our system works, there's less pressure, he believes, to have reform. So that said to me right there, we need to continue the pressure to activate. We need to continue the demonstrations. We need to continue for people to demand change in this moment. This is not going to happen simply because this is a Black issue. In some ways, this is a reflective of the fact we've been saying for a year now that we have two pandemics. We have the coronavirus pandemic, we have the systemic racism pandemic. For the coronavirus, we know if this was a coronavirus only affected Black people or only affected brown people or only affected any one narrow group other than whites, there would not have been the billions of dollars poured into it. There would not have been the entire shutdown of the government. None of that would have happened. It happened because coronavirus affects everybody. And so part of the responsibility that you and I, that Steve and I have, certainly here locally, is to make the case that systemic racism affects everybody. There is an economic cost to systemic racism, not just specifically around police violence, but systemic racism in general. There are estimates that it costs this economy here locally and regionally in the billions of dollars in lost economic opportunity. And so one of the responsibilities that we have is to connect the dots, create a through line between our pain and other people's loss as well, so that we can get a broad collaboration to work on these issues and to insist that we see change.
Yeah, but we speaking as the we see change. Let's just define the we. Is the we the Black? Are we siloed? And so we have the we as the Black community. We have the we as the Jewish community. We have the we as the Hispanic community, et cetera, et cetera. Steve, we're in the community relations business. We're coalition builders. Is there a coalition? Again, just energized by this momentum, so that the we is not a separate group approaching government, approaching the judicial system, but it's a collective we. Is that a possibility? You're muted.
It's only 16 months into the pandemic, right? About muting. Stephen's seen that act before, but Stephen put his finger on a point, and something actually just at the mirror point about collaboration is our Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, which is Upper Midwest's Federal Reserve, has a very progressive president, Neil Kashkari, and the bank, Federal Reserve Bank has engaged, along with the National Reserve System, in a system of series of talks and lectures, et cetera. And it's called our Federal Reserve calls it the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute. And I think a point where people can rally around is to learn the basic economic facts, as Steven is highlighting, and what it means to our economy, and what a drag it is in every sense of the word that people don't have the opportunity to prosper. And we're going to collaborate in a program. We've collaborated in programs in the past, that is JCRC, Urban League, Minnesota Business Partnership, et cetera, on this specific piece of housing discrimination and what that means at all levels. I mean, housing discrimination, among other things, means that people who have an unstable housing situation, the children, for instance, struggle with education because of, for any number of reasons, including the correlation between neighborhoods that have inadequate housing and the education that accompanies them. The Federal Reserve, Neil Kashkari, and our former Minnesota State Supreme Court Justice Alan Page are leading an effort to enshrine an adequate and good education, that's not quite the legal term for it, into our state constitution. So all of these things are very much related, right? And it's something we need to pay attention to. And going back to your point, I think it affords for a very broad coalition of peoples, because who doesn't support the need for greater inclusion in our economy? And you don't have to be left, you don't have to be right, you don't have to be Republican, you don't have to be Democrat, because it's just basic economic sense. A piece of history here, when Hubert Humphrey was elected mayor in 1945, the city was facing, I'm sorry to say, some of the same issues that we face today with segregation and exclusion and housing issues and the like. And one of the things he set about was to create a better future for Minneapolis, but particularly for African Americans and Jews and Japanese Americans and other groups. And we passed amongst the first open housing and anti-job discrimination ordinances applying to the city of Minneapolis in the country. One of the first FEPCs, for instance. And that, because it was the right thing to do, but he also said it was retarding the economic development of the city of Minneapolis, which was true. So going back to this point, if you want to advance, we've got to make this we've got to increase the strength of the economy and make sure it's an inclusive economy. And I completely agree with the Federal Reserve on that point. And it's something we can all work together to achieve.
I appreciate that. I appreciate both Stephen and Steve speaking about the economy. Let's get back to the police department and the systemic issues directly related to the police department. The United States Attorney General is now looking at the Minneapolis Police Department. Is there a potential for there to be a collaborative coalitional effort across the spectrum of ethnicities and faiths to address this issue? Or is Minnesota or Minneapolis, the St. Paul, Twin Cities, not ready for it? What potentially can be done, Stephen, collectively?
So keep in mind that, Black people comprise less than 15% actually people of color comprise about 15% of the state population. And so there's no way that we're going to move this agenda forward without there being a collaborative effort.
Right.
Having said that, it's important to keep in mind that the Black community is not a monolith any more so than the Jewish community is. And so outsiders looking in assume that all Jews are thinking and acting the same. I know enough from my friendship with Steve to know that there are holy and unholy wars that take place within your caucus.
As you know, even amongst ourselves, is 2 Jews, but there's at least 3 opinions.
There you go. All right. Well, same is true in the African American community. And on issues of social justice, criminal justice, economic justice, there are fault lines in there. And so getting specifically to the issue of police reform and addressing the justice system, you have a very progressive, I would say even, a very left-wing group of activists in the Black community who are pushing an agenda that was framed early last summer with the defund movement. They are, my own characterization is that they are not the mainstream. They certainly don't represent the perspective that the Urban League does. But you also have, and then on the, at the opposite end of the extreme, you have a lot of people who support law enforcement, who don't want to see changes, fundamental changes in the way that law enforcement is constructed. And in the middle, you have a lot of people who live in communities that are over-policed, but also under-resourced and also overrepresented in crime. And so the challenge is to make sure that all of that narrative bubbles up as Black perspective without being a singular view, and that you're able to get all of these different groups and stakeholders at the table. In answer to your direct answer to your question, Michael, yes, I think it's possible. I'm welcome the involvement in the investigation by the United States Attorney General, and I think it's overdue. It's probably several decades overdue, but I welcome it happening at this moment. I think there will be broad scale cooperation and participation and support for this. I am part of some efforts of community groups that are leaning into this. In fact, we've got a meeting this evening, a briefing by the U.S. Attorney's Office to talk about this investigation and how we can support it. And so, yeah, I think it's hopeful it's possible, but I need to be clear that in Minnesota in particular, where you do not have even, anywhere near a 51% majority of people of color, let alone African Americans, you have to do things in collaboration and in cooperation with others.
And thank you. And what percentage of the Minnesota population is Jewish, Steve?
I was about to add to Steven's 15%, the 1% of the Minnesota Jewish community, and we can toss in our wonderful communities in North Dakota and South Dakota, which number in the hundreds, right? But that's maybe missing the point slightly, because, of course, I think we take pride, Michael, in a community that's organized, in a community that's ready for activism, a community that wants to punch beyond its weight, and particularly in coalition building too, because we see this as a mission for our community to better the world in any number of ways. We too welcome the Justice Department's investigation into the Minneapolis Police Department, with whom it cannot be denied we've had historically close relationships and working relationships over the years. I will point out, and Stephen mentioned it briefly, listen, the African-American chief of police went on the stand in the trial and completely rebutted everything that the defendant had to say about standards and the way he conducted himself when he murdered George Floyd. That's important. That shows you that there is accountability at the top, as did the most tenured officer in the Minneapolis police also said the same thing. So there is, I would say, a capacity for change and a capacity to learn. And of course, with the full weight of the federal government, the Justice Department brought upon the city of Minneapolis, of course, that's a serious amount of leverage. At the same time, and we'll all be, watching carefully, and to the extent that we're asked to participate, because after all, this is for the greater good of the community. And I want to mention one thing, and we mentioned something about the Minnesota National Guard in our last paragraph of our statement. Again, this sort of goes to how we view things. Stephen, in our review session yesterday, as we were preparing for this thing, opened my eyes to some really important points about how certain communities see the Guard, particularly when they're on the streets, and those are the neighborhoods in which folks are living, and you see people in Humvees and machine guns and the like. It can feel like an army of occupation. We see things differently in the sense that, of course, we've worked closely with the Guard over the years. We understand the brother, cousin, co-workers, family, neighbors, and the like, who are caught in a very difficult position. Both are true, by the way. Both are absolutely true. And this goes to how we have civil engaged conversation, which I believe are the hallmarks of our democracy, is the ability to talk about different perspectives and the amalgamation of those perspectives, which perhaps creates a truth, or at least some semblance of the truth. And Stephen and I have known each other long enough, and it's one of the great friendships in my life, that we can have these conversations about disparate views of commonality. And I hope that we can replicate this for the entire community, because we need to have these tough conversations, because everything that we're talking about today falls within the realm of the difficult. But there is no way that we're going to advance as a community without addressing tough issues, addressing them with love, but nevertheless, love between ourselves, but nevertheless acknowledging that they're difficult and we may have different points of view, but in the end, we have the same hope.
Well, thank you. But Stephen, do you see opportunities with the Jewish community now being presented of bridging some of the divides that Steve alluded to. Let's start with my first question about the atmosphere. Is the climate now more conducive for bridge building among African Americans and Jews, or is there still a wariness? There's still tension that hasn't yet been overcome.
I think that it's sort of transactional at this point. So it depends on what the relationships are. It needs to be said, it's been implied here, but it needs to be said here that, in fact, I think, Michael, you touched on it in your opening comments, that Jews have always been a part of, and indeed at the forefront of the civil rights movement.
Yes.
That relationship historically is important, and it informs the basis for a compact going forward. On the other hand, these kind of relationships need to be nurtured over time. We simply cannot take it for granted, nor can we point to some historical relationship as a basis for our continued relationship. We have to nurture those things. So Steve and I work actively on maintaining our relationship. We engage with each other, and I'm grateful. I will acknowledge that Steve reached out to me first about 6 years ago when I came to the Urban League Twin Cities, and I'm grateful that I didn't know who the heck he was at the time. Actually, I did, because I knew his dad. I knew he was, but I welcome and open that relationship. But that was deliberate on his part. As part of his, community relations work, yes, but I also think it's part of who Steve is in wanting to have authentic relationships. And so when tough times happen, when Mother Emanuel, Steve was one of the first ones to reach out to me and said, I know it's, 1,000 miles away, but I imagine you're feeling it. What can we do? Just want you to know we're here. And similarly, likewise, when was it River of Life or
Tree of Life?
Tree of Life, reaching out to him with the same kind of message. These are kind of things that need to happen. They happen on a transactional basis, on a one-on-one, but they also need to happen more broadly. One of the reasons that the JCRC here and the Urban League Twin Cities here have worked to put on programs together is to create these opportunities. Steve didn't mention that the Jewish Community Relations Council here, which has significant capacity, has staff to work on congregational safety, on protecting, has done workshops at the Urban League where we brought together the African American pastors so that they could hear a presentation from his staff about how they're making their synagogue safe, and those same resources are made available to the many Black churches that are here in the Twin Cities. But it's building on those relationships so that when we have something in common, when we have an opportunity and a challenge, when we have momentum, like now, we're able to create. We're not making cold calls on each other, if I could use that term, when you need somebody to show up at a table or at a meeting or to sign a document or to just share ideas about how they're going to do what they're going to do in this moment. So I think the short answer to your question, I gave you the long answer already, is yes. There is an opportunity here. I think there's also activity here to support that, and there will be more. There will be need for more going forward.
Well, are you sure you're not Jewish? You gave a very long Jewish answer, but
We'll check. We'll check.
I do want to ask one more question before we wrap up, and it could be a potential for being a flashpoint, and that's the state of Israel. Does the state of Israel act as a potential bonding agent, or is it more potentially a lightning rod in terms of building relationships between the Black and the Jewish communities? We talked before the program began that Steven is not only a retired lawyer, but he's also, he's not a retired pastor, but he has a ordination as a minister. So from the framework of the congregation within which you work, and the congregation, Steve, within which you pray, is there any potential around Israel, the history of Israel, let alone the modern Israel, for that to be a bridging agent?
I'll let Steve go first.
Oh, Stephen. Well, I guess the Jewish answer, Michael, is both, right? And again, this goes to the multiplicity of both of our communities, right? And the different points of views in both communities, and perhaps generational lines, as it does in our community, plays a difference too. I would say, in broad strokes, with the African American leadership with whom I most visit and talk with, generally older segment of the African American community, like me, I'm 58, and etc. I think Israel is generally viewed as the African American community understanding the broad stream Jewish support for the state of Israel, as well as appreciating some of the aspects of the state and some of the struggles it's faced, etc. over time. Maybe going back to the days of Dr. Martin Luther King, who very much was very sympathetic towards the idea of Zionism in Israel and the like. But just like in our own community, I think the younger members of the African American community have a different view of Israel. And we always welcome the opportunity for a full-fledged, honest discussion about Israel, its glories and its beauties and its difficulties simultaneously, right? And I think a hallmark of any mature relationship is the ability to take a difficult issue. Israel is beloved to us. If take the African American community, where there perhaps is less information about Israel and or a different perspective on Israel, and try to see where it is we come out when we have a good, honest, healthy discussion about it.
Right, Stephen?
Yeah, I'd say that the trick is to make sure that you have the relationships in place, that you can have healthy discussions, because frankly, I know that the African American community benefits from having honest feedback on strategic initiatives, on issues, on challenges, on leadership from a broad base of the community, but you want to get that feedback from trusted relationships. And the same is true in terms of providing feedback and perspective on Israel. I would say from a faith perspective, that Christians tend to be in favor generally of Israel. We understand the biblical call for Israel to have its own state. We understand Zionism as certainly from a pastoral, but also from a theological perspective. The challenge tends to be both generationally, but also, within specific segments, would be on the issue of Palestine, whom Black people tend to look as cousins in some way, sort of as people of color, and so the relationship with Palestine would be an issue. Just as sort of the issue, Israel's relationship with other Arab states would be an issue. But in terms of the Zionism itself and the establishment of Israel as a state, the maintenance of Israel as a state, I think there's pretty broad support for that. But more importantly, is the issue that you've been talking about. Do you have the relationships in place where you can talk about these things honestly, and where you can actually value and can honor feedback, and where you can agree to disagree without becoming disagreeable?
Right. Well, thank you for that. And some of the most exhilarating trips that I've led to Israel, I've led over 100 missions to Israel from New York. Some of the most just memorable ones were with Black pastors, some Latino pastors as well, and seeing Israel through their eyes. And what they're going to see is that Israel, about 40% of Israel is made up of Jews of color, Jews from the Middle East, Jews from Ethiopia. There's so much which we need to learn. And I'm very, very hopeful, based on this conversation, that the momentum will, from what I'm hearing, is that the momentum will continue, and not only continue, but also to grow. I can't express stronger in stronger terms my gratitude to Steven Belton and Steve Hunegs for joining us on Community Relations Corner today. Really a momentous experience for those who participated, and for the hundreds, if not thousands, who are going to be seeing this program once it's posted online. I also hope, Stephen and Steve, that folks in your respective communities will take a look at this video and learn from it about the potential to move our agendas forward, not independently of each other, but arm in arm, as we were during the civil rights movement, as we ought to be today as well. And with that, I'm going to turn to both of you to share just a few final thoughts with us. I'll first turn to, we open with Steven, so we'll start this case with Steve, and we'll close with Steven. So Steve, a few last words.
Thank you, Rabbi. And again, a mazel tov for you and all that you've given to our community on an ongoing basis. So look forward to working with you. And we too have missions, and maybe Stephen will go on our next mission to Israel starting in November. We'll see it. Not putting any pressure on you, Stephen, you and the mayor. So anyways, but I appreciate the fact that perhaps missing from our conversation is a female voice today. And, I brought with me one of my favorite books. It's Hope in the Struggle by one of our great civil rights pioneers in Minnesota, Josie Johnson, someone who Stephen, of course, knows very well. I just want to read a paragraph from it, from her acknowledgement, just to sort of bring a female voice into our discussion today. And this is just the last paragraph of the prologue to her book. She writes, Josie, I believe that we carry the seeds of love and justice from our ancestors. I write this book for my children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren with the hope that that current and future generations will remember the strength of our ancestors, learn from my story, continue the struggle, and succeed in gaining justice for our people. And I'll take, the Yiddish word unser, our, right, and to describe all of us, right, African Americans, Jews, and the entirety of the community. So I like to leave with words of Josie Johnson.
Thank you very much, Steve. Very inspirational. Stephen?
I don't have inspirational words. I would thank my old friend, Steve Hunegs, for recommending me for this program, and my new friend, Michael Miller, for your gracious hosting of me in this program. I'm here because there's work to do and we need help. We need allies. But I'm also here because more humanistically, in my community and my work, we often talk about the African diaspora. Jews are another diaspora, but in this case, I would actually speak to the human diaspora, that point out that my pain is connected to your pain, but also my victories are connected to your victories. We are inviting you to share in the pain, but also share in the march toward victory. There is much work to be done and much labor to be borne, and we will have to do it in compact with others who are like-minded and who have big hearts. And so my hope and my prayer is not for heart surgery or even heart massaging, but simply the presence and the acknowledgement that we can be led by our hearts.
And true. There's a Jewish expression of a lev tahor, a pure heart. And I think that's the heart that we're seeking. And I'm going to finish, since I've already been called rabbi, been outed. But Steve quoted from the Ethics of the Fathers. I'm going to quote as well. One of the statements there is, Aseh lecha rav uknei lecha chaver. Make for yourself a teacher and acquire for yourself a friend. I think all of us who have participated in this conversation, not just the three of us, but those who have been watching us live and those who will view us on tape, we have learned a lot. We have taught and we have learned, and hopefully, God willing, we've also acquired friends. Thank you so much for participating. My thanks to all of our viewers, and we look forward to seeing you next time on Community Relations Corner. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful. Goodbye and shalom.
Shalom.